Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. I am Rosie Lindap. I'm a Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the BIA. And we are delighted to be having this webinar today to launch our new report, Evaluating Patient Access to Rare Disease Treatments, Insights from the UK and Beyond. Now, this report has been developed by our Rare Disease Industry Group at the BIA, which is a group of our members all focused on developing treatments for rare diseases. And we've worked with the team at PwC to develop this report, and we'll be hearing directly from Steve Ahern, who leads that team at PwC later to provide a bit more detail on the report. We'll also be hearing from our panel of experts. So we have Nick Mead from Genetic Alliance, Tina Taup from FPIA, and Sean Richardson from Alexion. We will be going through some questions, and we also will have some time for audience Q&A towards the end. So please do submit your questions via the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. I will now hand over to Steve, who's going to be giving a bit of an overview of the report, and then we'll be back later to discuss those findings in a bit more detail. Thanks all.
Thanks, Rosie. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. I think when Rosie and the BIA asked us to support in the preparation of the important piece of research, we absolutely jumped at the chance, given the importance of access to medicines for rare disease patients. So I think I have about 10 minutes to highlight some of the key aspects of the report, and then we can debate things on the panel. So maybe on to the next couple of slides here. So yeah, before diving in, I think it's important to, if you go on to the next one, sorry, Annika, important to address some of the important challenges that really pervade the whole access environment for rare diseases. It's challenging because of their unique characteristics. So they have small patient populations. The majority of the diseases affect the pediatric population, so more than 75%. And there's still relatively high R&D costs per patient. And so you get a more limited evidence base because of the fewer patients that are available to recruit onto clinical trials. So this all results in a much more challenging environment to demonstrate that traditional clinical evidence base, and therefore to meet the traditional cost effectiveness measures. It's not unique to the UK. It's something that all global healthcare systems are grappling with. So learning from what others are doing is really important. So on to the next slide. So the key changes to the UK rare disease market access environment we looked at since 2021, which is when the last report, A Rare Chance for Reform, came out. We spoke to a lot of stakeholders across rare disease, the rare disease ecosystem, to industry participants, ex-regulators and current regulators and policymakers, and to patient groups. And the key areas we looked at were the UK rare disease framework. We looked at the NICE methods review. We looked at some of those new mechanisms, the Innovation Licensing and Access Pathway, so ILAP, and also the Innovative Medicines Fund, IMF. And we reviewed those with a lot of people in focus groups and through separate interviews. So moving on to the findings. So firstly, the framework. If you move on to the next slide. So the framework, it really does build on the 2013 strategy for rare diseases, and we think it represents a bit more of a holistic approach to improving the lives of patients with rare diseases. The framework had 4 priority areas. The first was improving speed of diagnosis. Second was increasing awareness of rare diseases and education amongst healthcare professionals. Third was better coordination of care across the care ecosystem. And the fourth priority, which is really the focus of our report, was improving access to medicines and drugs and specialist care. The framework provides a bit of a 5-year strategic direction for the UK, with each home nation mandated to develop their own specific measurable action plan against these 4 priorities. And the interesting and important thing is that there are 3 key stakeholder groups that help to coordinate, to drive policy, to set action plans, and monitor the progress of these. All of these are chaired by pretty senior stakeholders. So the first is the Rare Disease Framework Board, which is chaired by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer from England, with rotating chairs from the equivalent positions from the separate home nations. The second is the Rare Disease Framework Delivery Group, which is responsible for producing and monitoring the nation's action plans. And the third is the Rare Disease Forum, which really supports engagement between the Framework Board, the nation-specific delivery groups, and the rare disease community at large. So each of these really does demonstrate a significant commitment from senior stakeholders across the ecosystem. And these are seen as quite positive movements in the right direction by the stakeholders. However, it's quite recent development, so it's still a bit too early to fully measure the full impact of the framework. It's definitely raised awareness of the challenges faced by rare disease patients. And there's a commitment also in the framework to evaluate the effectiveness of some of the other pathways, which we'll talk about in a bit. So ILAP, for example, and the Innovative Medicine Fund. So it's seen as encouraging greater coordination. And we do hope that it sort of drives material improvements against those 4 priorities. The second one we looked at was really the NICE methods review, which was a review of the approach that NICE takes to its health technology assessments, and it was completed in January 2022. The changes were really across 5 key areas. The first was an acceptance of a greater level of uncertainty in the evidence base. Now that's expected to significantly benefit rare diseases, which, as I said earlier, have this inherent challenge around their evidence base that they can create. The second was the provision of further guidance for the inclusion of real-world data, real-world evidence in health technology assessments. And again, this should benefit rare diseases where real-world evidence can be used. The third was the replacement of the end-of-life QALY modifier to a severity modifier, which is believed to support rare diseases better and non-oncology medications. The fourth was a broader consideration of quality of life measures when the standard EQ5D questionnaire is not appropriate. Again, better for rare diseases. And then the fifth was a reduction in the HST eligibility criteria from 7 down to 4 to simplify that. And although it's not part of the methods review, NICE also confirmed that their inclusion of HST committee members who were experienced in rare diseases would sit on the STA committees where rare diseases are being reviewed. And now that's quite a recent change, but that should improve the review for STAs that cover orphan diseases. So the conclusion of the methods review is that along with some of those other changes, it's a move and a step in the right direction and a move forward. And it should benefit many orphan diseases. However, we know that there are going to be many orphan diseases and ultra orphan drugs that will still go through the STA process and will be subject to the much lower ISA, which means it will be still challenging for many of those drugs to be reimbursed. So while there are some good examples of how the changes are working in practice, for example, the real world evidence and uncertain evidence base, there do remain challenges to be addressed going forward. If we flick onto the next page, the other areas we looked at were ILAP. So, firstly, ILAP was launched in 2021, and while specifically for innovative medicines, it does have some applicability criteria for rare diseases. Now, the principles of ILAP were to reduce the time to market for innovative medicines by driving greater engagement between the developers and regulatory bodies such as the MHRA and NICE and the SMC in Scotland. Now, the eligibility criteria for ILAP is that the medicine must be either treating life-threatening diseases or seriously debilitating conditions. So clearly, many rare diseases will fit into the criteria. From the research, it was seen that it's useful for smaller biotech potentially where perhaps they have less internal resource available. The access to expert input from regulators and reimbursement agencies was seen as beneficial, as it's useful to understand, the types of evidence that are needed. But there were some challenges, and those challenges were around some of the resource constraints in some of those ILAP partners, which was seen as potentially limiting the benefits of the scheme. But ILAP will be reviewed as one of England's action plans from the Rare Disease Framework. And so that will be good to see whether there are any improvements that are necessary. If we turn to the Innovative Medicines Fund, Now this was set up by NHS England and NICE with the aims of providing consistent and transparent processes for managed access agreements for non-oncology drugs. And it was modelled on the Cancer Drug Fund, which has been seen as a success. And like the Cancer Drug Fund, there's 340 million per annum that could be allocated to non-oncology innovative medicines. But to date, no drugs, rare disease or otherwise, have actually gone through or been funded by IMF. Now the potential reasons for that could be that it's just a recency of the fund being set up. It could be that the appropriate assessments are going through the STA or HST. But actually, from our discussions and reviewing, it's more likely to be due to the structure of the fund, where there are some significant obligations placed on manufacturers, which are preventing drugs really going through it. And discussing with stakeholders, it's believed that those obligations are overly onerous. So, for example, if a drug's not approved through after 5 years for reimbursement, the manufacturers have to fund the patient for the rest of their lives. Now, given that many of those diseases are in pediatric population, that could lead to funding for many decades, which is challenging. So it's very different to a situation in the Cancer Drug Fund. Now, a positive is that the IMF is going to be reviewed as part of the England 2023 action plan, and one hopes that will affect a change, and some of that 340 million per annum could be allocated to rare diseases as we go forward. So flicking on to the next slide. So looking at the comparison of the UK versus other OECD countries. Now this is an extract from the FPIA data, the Waiting to Access Innovative Therapies report. And on the left, it compares the number of days between market authorization and the appearance on the public reimbursement lists for non-oncology orphan drugs. And here you can see that relatively England and Scotland are faster than France and Spain, but significantly slower than Germany, which is at 78 days. And on the right-hand side, this is the percentage of approved non-oncology orphan drugs appearing on the reimbursement list. Here, England and Scotland are at 59 and 55% respectively, which is below Germany and France that are much higher at 86% and 77%, but just above Spain at 52%. So if we flick onto the next slide, we see that, when we look at the OECD countries and their approaches to supporting access to rare disease treatments, the countries we looked at were Germany, Spain, and France in Europe. Australia and Canada were a bit further afield, and we looked at the US as well. Now, the key approaches fall into three categories. The first is really where there's an existence of an MA or pricing process that was applicable to all drugs, but might have elements in it that really support the access to rare disease medicines. And this was the case in Germany, France, Australia, and Canada. The second was whether there was a specialised pathway for orphan drugs. And the third was whether there was dedicated funding to enable access to orphan drugs. And so if we flick on to the next slide, I'll rattle through these because we don't have a huge amount of time. But, Germany has free pricing for 6 months and also focuses on incremental health benefits as opposed to the cost effectiveness measures that you see in the UK. Similarly, in France, they focus on incremental health benefits. In Australia, while there are cost effectiveness reviews, there's no formal threshold for that cost effectiveness in the HTA. And then interestingly, in Australia and Canada, you have a bit of a parallel MA and HTA process so it's not fully sequential, and there's a bit of overlap there, which can help speed things up. And then other specific drug mechanisms for orphan diseases, many of these relate to the MA process and the speed of review for the MA. But interestingly, in Germany, it had a reduced HTA pathway for orphan drugs for the HTA process. And then finally, just flicking on to the funding, in France, there was a dedicated fund for innovative medicine, the Licensus. And then in Canada, in March 23, they announced a 1.4 billion Canadian dollar fund to fund that and support access for orphan medicines. So that's a bit of a rattle through some of the OECD comparisons, and we can touch on a bit of those maybe in the panel. But maybe so just our overall reflections on the work. Clearly, access to rare diseases is inherently challenging, and it's a global phenomenon because of sort of patient numbers, etc. But the recent changes in the UK are seen as positive steps in the right direction, but the changes are quite recent, and so the full effect of those haven't really fully been seen. But we do think there are, many real challenges that are limiting access to rare diseases, which do need to be addressed if the framework ambition is to be met. And finally, I think there are some really valuable examples of what you see in other countries and other OECD countries that are supporting faster and effective access to orphan drugs that could be interesting to build on for the future in the UK. Anyway, back to you, Rosie. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Steve. That was a great overview. And if that's piqued your interest, then I'd encourage you to read the full report, which is now available on our website. So do check that out after today's webinar. So now we'll be going into the panel discussion. So yeah, if the rest of our panelists could turn their cameras and mics on. And I'll start by asking each of them to introduce themselves. So Nick, coming to you first, if you could give a quick intro.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks for having me today. My name is Nick. I'm Director of Policy at Genetic Alliance UK, and we're the UK Alliance for everyone living with rare genetic and undiagnosed conditions. We've got more than 230 patient support organisation members. Thanks,
Nick. Tina?
Thank you. So my name is Tina Tauber. I'm working for FPA, which is the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry and Associations, and with this, I'm Director for Market Access and also leading on the orphan drug policy.
That's great. Thanks, Tina. And Sean.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Richardson. I'm the chair of the BIA Rare Disease Industry Group and also general manager for Lexion in the UK and Ireland.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, we'll go into some discussion now. So staying with you, Sean, in your role as chair of our Rare Disease Industry Group, you represent the BIA on the UK Rare Disease Forum. And Steve touched on some of the benefits of the forum in his presentation there. I was wondering if you could share some of your reflections on those benefits.
Yeah, definitely. So when you think about the rare disease framework, what is obvious from attending the forum meetings is that it's provided a strategic focus across all 4 nations. And it has certainly captured the range of challenges that are countered right across the rare disease landscape and importantly where actions are needed. What I've seen is that it's really clear that where there are issues which impact all 4 nations, that there's real strong collaboration. So rather than action plans being developed completely independently by each nation, they're looking at cross-cutting themes and where there are learnings and where actually projects can be done together. It also is very evident from the meetings that there's collaboration across the delivery partners, as well as the wider rare disease community. And why that's really important is because the views of the patients are feeding directly into the planning. As well as setting out the plans, the other thing that I've seen is the emergence of measures. So it's great to have plans, but then you've got to put some measures in place to say, well, are you actually delivering? And what impact is that delivery having? And I think what is very noticeable is the shift, because we're halfway through the framework now. We're in the second year of the action plans. And there's a clear commitment to say, right, we've identified some actions. Now let's deliver on those actions rather than repeatedly creating more actions year on year. And again, I think that's very encouraging. So there's a real commitment to deliver on the actions that have been created already. What also is evident, I think there are competing pressures. So it's great having the framework, but there's lots of other policy which is in place within whether government or NHS, and it has pressures on resourcing. So the delivery to make sure that resources in place to deliver on the action plan can be very challenging. Not forgetting that it's highly possible that in the middle of all the framework, there will be a general election and a potential change of government. We've also got the commissioning reforms, seeing the shift in specialised services. So there's a lot of changing landscape while trying to deliver a plan. I don't think the challenge of that can be underestimated. And then I think that the final thing that I see is that so we're already halfway through this framework. I can't believe that it's gone so quickly, but I think what is clear that there is the requirement that beyond 2025 we continue with it'll be an updated framework and continuing action. So yeah, I think there's a real probably plea here. Don't think everything's going to be done by the end of 2025, and there's no need to carry on. There's definitely need to have a sustained framework going beyond 2025.
Thanks, Sean. It's absolutely echo that. Cool. I'd just like to remind participants, some of you might have joined slightly late, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you'd like to submit any questions to our panel, we will have time for those later. So yeah, do submit your questions and have a think of those whilst you're listening to the panel discussion. Nick, going to be coming to you next. Sticking with some of the positives for now, I wondered if you could share your reflections on sort of the key positive changes the rare disease patient community has seen in recent years.
Thanks, Rosie. Just reflecting on Sean's comments, I think you're right, Sean, that the voice of people living with rare conditions is coming through more effectively this time around. Governments are listening more, and you can see that in the action plan responses and their updates on progress. Genetic Alliance UK has been working with governments to make sure that our voice is coming through, but governments has also been convening groups of people living with conditions with a real emphasis on diversity of voice as well. In terms of our community is really diverse, and the priorities that each member of the community would pick would be different, and success in implementing this framework is probably not going to be instantly felt by our community. But if you twist my arm and make me pick something that is maybe showing the most progress, then I think I'd probably choose diagnosis, because we've got the most amount of visible progress happening there. So diagnosis is crucially important to people living with rare conditions. It's a defining component of everyone's experience. That might be a bad element in that it might be a very long or incomplete diagnostic odyssey that's got misdiagnoses or delays, but it could be a really rapid, accurate and effective diagnosis with information delivered at the right point. We're heading more towards being able to expect that positive experience of a diagnosis in the UK now. We're making progress in screening and getting out of our position behind more than 20 European countries that screen for more conditions than us. We have a blood spot task group that the UK National Screening Committee have convened, and we have actually announced the newest condition on our heel prick test, which is the first one since 2015. There's a lot more progress that needs to be made there, but at least we can see some change happening. And we've got the generation study from Genomics England too, which is a research project looking at genomics as a tool for newborn screening. Alongside that progress in screening, we're also making progress in delivering genomic medicine with new genomic medicine services in England and Wales, and progress in that direction in Scotland and Northern Ireland too. But as I say, there's still a lot of challenges even in this area of positivity. We need to make sure that everyone in the UK is experiencing the same access to high quality diagnosis. This emphasis on genomics potentially leaves out non-genetic rare conditions. And we need to make sure that our diagnostic pathways are fair to everyone living in the UK. There's a big history of focusing on white Caucasian genomes, and that means that we're not going to be as good at diagnosing rare conditions in people with other ethnic backgrounds until we start addressing that dogma. So positives in diagnosis, but there's still a lot of work to be done there.
Thanks, Nick. Moving on to Tina now. Taking a European angle on this, I wondered if you could share some of your thoughts on where we've seen some progress in Europe and how that might compare to the UK.
Thank you very much. I would like to highlight really two key points from a European perspective, which is, first of all, although it is a bit, well, back then introduced in 2000 already, but it's really the introduction of the orphan medicine and product regulation. Why this is important? Because this regulation lays out the incentives in order to ensure investment into R&D for rare diseases. We have currently around 450 orphan medicinal products with an active status, and half of them would have not been economically viable without the regulation. So therefore, this is crucially important. We can say it's a European success story, and it's up for revision, where we might come to a bit later. But this is a crucial point and a real success, and where we see progress which have been made over the years. A second point I wish to raise is very clearly the introduction of the European reference networks, where we have currently 24 centers for rare diseases or complex disease areas. And it's also important, although of course how healthcare systems are set up, how products are reimbursed, etc., is a national competence. It's important because if we talk about rare diseases, we talk about rare evidence, we talk about rare knowledge, and therefore it's important to connect those who are treating patients, who are patients living with a rare disease and affected families, and also with specialized healthcare centers, and really to order to learn together, but also ensure, of course, a bit of coordination. There's still quite a long way to go, but those two, I would say, flagships I would like to highlight from a European perspective.
Thanks, Tina. That's really interesting. And yeah, finally coming to Steve for some thoughts on the positives. As you've set out in your presentation, we highlighted some of the key developments in those comparator countries. I wondered if you could pick maybe one of those that you think is the most interesting.
Thanks, Rosie. I suppose it's when you look at the FPIA data, the one country that stands out is Germany, and probably that's one of the most interesting. And I think there are two factors there. There's the first, which is it's supporting faster, whatever it is, it's supporting faster approval of reimbursement, but also broader access to orphan drugs. So those two elements are the free pricing. We think 6 months free pricing. It was 12 months, but that's reduced. And then the HTA approach, focusing and prioritizing incremental health benefits as opposed to cost effectiveness measures, as you see in the UK. So I think that 6 month pricing period, that's for all drugs. And so during that period, manufacturers are reimbursed fully through the German statutory insurance plans. And obviously, once the price is determined for 7 months and beyond, there is a rebate for where they've been sort of paid the free pricing period for sort of post 6 months, but it's an effective way of getting the product on to reimbursed. And then I guess the HTA process, that focus on incremental health benefits, it really does support access to orphan drugs, because often that higher price per patient relative to other drugs is and the more limited evidence base, can make proving that cost effectiveness more challenging. So these drugs are often first in class where there's no other treatment option. So it's easier to demonstrate that incremental health benefit versus that sort of cost effectiveness. And I think that's what's driving the difference in performance versus other comparator countries.
Thanks, Steve. And now I guess focusing a bit more on the challenges, some of which we identified in our report, and as Nick summarized earlier, we see a lot of progress, but there's a lot of challenges and things still to be overcome across all different areas here. So I guess, Steve, just coming back to you quickly on that German example you picked out, I guess are there challenges even within that positive example?
Well, I suppose in Germany, that free pricing period, it's core to, I think, what's driving the speed of access, but it does have a cost implication, and I think that as part of, I think it was changed from 12 months to 6 months in November 22 as part of the German Financial Stabilization Act, to deal with some of the burden of that impact, but they still have 6 months. And so, yes, it does create a short-term burden, but actually that's reduced when that's renegotiated. I think, as you see in other countries, in France, we mentioned that also has an HTA process that focuses on incremental health benefits. But actually, the performance in France is much slower than Germany in terms of the speed of reimbursement. And I think that's probably down to just a lot more complexity in their approach. And so they have separate grades of actual and relative health benefits versus comparators or current standard of care. But there's also limited transparency in how each of those drugs is awarded its HTA score. And so it's harder to assess how the drug might perform. And so those pricing negotiations take a long time, and they can be quite complex and lengthy. And I think that's partly why, despite having an incremental health benefit, that is driving a slower sort of progress versus, say, Germany, which is very fast.
Thanks, Steve. And then Tina, coming to you again, are there any particular challenges at the European level that you'd like to highlight?
Yes, I guess first of all, we need to remind ourselves a little bit the responsibilities between the European Union and member states. And just saying this because at the European level, there is clearly the legislative framework in a way for how medicines, vaccines, treatment options are authorized, how they are manufactured, distributed, monitored, etc. While the national systems are there to discuss how the healthcare system should be set up, how it should be future-proven in a way, and how does it reimburse treatment options. So I'm reminding this because if both parties work smoothly together, we can ensure on one side competitiveness for further research and R&D investment into Europe, and on the other hand, we ensure patients, we address the unmet medical need of patients. So now I'm coming back to this because access, although it's not a responsibility for the European Union, is quite a big topic, of course, combined with the affordability aspect. The various member states face to different extents. So therefore, as the instruments to address it, to solve it, are limited. What we've done as FPR, we worked with EURODIS, which is the European Organization for Rare Diseases, to come together and to discuss access proposals. So what can we put jointly on the table as a contribution for discussion in order to address access challenges, to increase equality as a second part, and therefore amongst other things where there is, for example, a commitment to file from FPR, meaning that the members of FPR admit to start to apply for the national pricing and reimbursement processes no later than 24 months after marketing authorization. We put forward a discussion contribution, you could say, in terms of equity-based tiered pricing. So how could it look like amongst the member states if we talk about this? But also how the European HTA, which is about to be implemented in the next 2 years to get ready for 2025, could play a role in order to address, to speed up the access discussions we might have when it comes to evidence, etc., what is needed, but also how can cross-country collaborations help on a voluntary level, but how they could help to support really speeding up the discussions, because the questions which are there are not unique. They are quite somehow the same. And so therefore it's about how can we ensure platforms, collaborations on a voluntary level in order to move the needle, knowing that member states are responsible for this question.
Thanks, Tina. It's really interesting. Coming to Nick next. I wondered if you could share your view on what the key sort of challenges facing the rare disease community in the UK are, having obviously discussed some of the positives and the challenges there, so what the key ones are in your perspective.
Well, just reflecting on the discussion so far, I think it's important to understand the necessity or need for certainty and confidence in our community around the future access to treatment. So with rare conditions where there's no medicine, the level of unmet health need can be extremely high. And that makes the stakes for incoming medicines high too, because they can change what might be progressive a condition that's really serious and with a kind of oncoming endpoint. It might completely change that trajectory, which can be incredibly meaningful for families, which makes the timing of the arrival of medicines quite important too. Our communities are very well connected around the world. They're small populations, so they network to make sure that they're connected with as many other people living the same lives as possible and to share information and so on, which means that we know about clinical trials happening in different parts of the world, and know when other countries are beginning to get access to treatments. And it's important to our communities that we in the UK get access to those treatments as soon as possible. Sometimes our community have participated in the clinical trials that have led to the development of that medicine, or natural history studies or other parts of the development process, so that they be brought here is an important thing. And then when they come here, our community want to be confident of that access process. We did a bit of work around managed access agreements, the way that NICE can sometimes hedge a decision, and found that that was quite a stressful experience for the community, because moving from a single assessment, they actually move into having a single assessment followed by a period of access that is supported by our community, followed by another whole access decision-making process. And the level of uncertainty that families have to live through that whole period is really difficult to deal with. A lot of pressure is put on the community to gather evidence and feed into those decision-making processes. So alongside, hoping that the NICE methods review brings enough to make those decisions more certain for our community, more likely that we'll be able to fund and access those treatments, I think if we can move away from methods like having a standard negative opinion at the consultation stage, then that would be really good for our community to try to take some of the pressure out of it from our side.
Thanks, Nick. I guess following on from that, coming to Sean, wanted to ask what your view is on industry's role in addressing some of these challenges. You're on mute, Sean.
Never cease to amaze me how frequently we completely forget to come off mute, but there we are. So yeah, I think industry's got a very broad role to play, and it's right across the different priority areas of the framework. So, whether that's looking at diagnostics, whether it's improving healthcare professional awareness and education, or indeed working with the NHS looking at services and delivery of care for patients. So I think one really sort of hot topic at the moment is clinical research, and there's no doubt, from the life sciences sector, we're a significant contributor to research into rare diseases. And a lot of that is either understanding the drivers of the conditions, or obviously finding new treatments that address unmet needs. What I think, there's probably a warning is that when we look at the recent landscape review by IHR and MRC, where it looked at the industry-sponsored activities across all stages of R&D, that since 2017 to 2021, the percentage of trials have fallen by 41%. So, that's been recognised, and the first thing I say is good that it has been recognised that there is a challenge here. But clinical trials are really important for the whole sort of end-to-end process for patients having access to new treatments. I think the O'Shaughnessy review has identified a number of measures which should bolster the UK environment, and it's got some bold targets to increase the activity there. But it's improving the timelines for clinical trial setup would go a long way to improving the UK's competitiveness. And obviously, when you have clinical trials in the UK, then patients with those diseases have access to medicines much earlier. The other area where I think we've got an important part to play, and it's been identified in Action 25 of the framework, is looking at the effectiveness of the new programs such as EAMS, ILAP, IMF, and are they delivering? And I think a common theme is that they're great initiatives, but they all have to work together if you then see the impact. And again, there's good engagement between the industry and the other delivery partners on that exact topic. And then the final thing, I think, and has been touched on, I think Tina's mentioned a few examples, as Stephen has as well, is learning from other markets. So certainly Germany and France have shown ways of probably having more flexible sort of risk-sharing approaches that speed up access into those markets. And I saw in one of the questions in the chat is how do we make sure that the UK remains or becomes a first wave country for launching new therapies? Well, it's exactly that. You have to make sure that the whole system is aligned, from clinical trials to having these early access schemes, which are aligned with market authorization as well as reimbursement. They're all connected. If you have that, we can absolutely be a wave one country.
Thanks. For the final set of questions, I wanted to look at some of the changes that are coming on the horizon and the potential impact of these changes for the rare disease community and treatments in particular. So starting with Tina, I know there's quite a few changes on the horizon in Europe, particularly with the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation. So appreciate that's quite a big topic, but I wondered if you could give a quick summary of the potential impacts of those changes in the rare disease space.
Thank you. I try to be very brave. So yes, we are in the middle of the revision of the pharmaceutical legislative framework. So what does it mean? The Commission proposed its proposal on how the general pharmaceutical legislation, the orphan drug regulation, as well as the pediatric regulation should be revised. In point of time, it's really important because all of this is more than 20 years old, and products coming today on the market look very different to the products we've seen 20 years ago, but also they will differ from the products we might see in 20 years. So it's really crucially important because it's about to ensure that we have a future-proven regulatory system, that we have clearly robust and predictable incentives, and intellectual property framework for this. So that's important, really coming back to the clinical trials mentioned by Sean, to ensure investment into R&D in Europe with this regard. So now what the Commission proposed when it really comes to the orphan drug regulation, in our perspective, it's not necessarily serving the objective or to reach the objective to do more for Europe, to do more for ensuring competitiveness, to close the gap. When we discuss a bit the investment gap we have between Europe and the US, it's quite on the contrary. And we just took as FPL the proposals by the Commission and put this in a modeling. Of course, yes, you can discuss methods when it is about modeling, but it's one approach to clarify a bit what we talk about here. And when we take the proposed changes like reducing incentives on orphan market exclusivity and also the validity of the orphan drug status into account, for example, we come up to that in the future, we might see about 45 products less, which would impact 1.5 million people living with a rare disease, which is quite a number, which is not necessarily serving the purpose to address unmet medical need, because we've heard it. We talk about rare diseases where the majority begins in childhood. A lot of them have genetic causes. And for 95%, we don't have a treatment option at all because the science is so challenging. So therefore, this is not moving into the right direction, but it's the proposal from the Commission. There is more to come. So the Parliament as well as the Council have to make up their mind, and then they have to negotiate. So it's just the beginning of a rather long journey, I would expect. And therefore, please allow me one or two sentences in the end. So yes, the revision of the regulation is important because it's one piece to address investment and to serve patients' need. On the other hand, we need to have a more holistic view on how to move the needle for patients living with a rare disease. Why? Because I said it already that the scientific challenges are huge. So therefore, more collaboration is needed on a supranational level in order to ensure really to do this, especially in the translational ecosystem for research. How do we conduct trials when we talk about very small sample sizes? But also having the science right, having ideally the regulation right to set incentives. We also need to discuss access very clearly at national level and how pathways could look like to also progress there.
Thanks, Tina. That was a great summary. we'll do a couple more questions and then we will come to some of the questions from the audience. So Sean, I wanted to ask you about a key change which is coming in the UK, and that's the MHRA's international recognition procedure, which will be going live from the start of next year. So if you could share some of your thoughts on that, particularly within the rare disease space.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, I think any focus on the regulatory assessment, looking for improvements, is always welcome. I think the early assessment of the IRP, it's not straightforward. I have to be honest, for innovative medicines in rare diseases, because as it stands at the moment, they will fall under the recognition B part. That's the 110-day approval pathway with a clock stop. And why that becomes quite important is because it's hard to see exactly where the advantage is going ahead versus the national procedure, because to go through recognition B, you've got to already been approved somewhere else. So going back to the waves, you're almost putting the UK in a later stage if for orphan medicines, if they all fall under recognition B pathway. The other thing which, and I know this is it's not a new topic, but the relationship between getting market authorization and getting reimbursement cannot be separated. So we've seen, the problems if you have very early market authorizations and then long delays to reimbursement can have direct impacts on, let's say, exclusion from schemes like VPAS. So you want to shorten that time. But if you speed up the regulatory assessment, by doing that, one of the consequences is that you're going to have less mature evidence base going into that. And that less mature evidence base, when you go into an appraisal process for reimbursement, results in uncertainty. And we know that uncertainty usually results in a lower cost. So this is one that's not straightforward how to resolve it, but clearly we don't want a long gap between regulatory approval and reimbursement. But equally, we want to make sure that by having earlier regulatory approval, it doesn't reduce the value of the medicine going through an assessment. So I might sound like a stuck record here, but it's that end-to-end process. It's really got to be thought about any changes to the regulatory process is done with that view on whether it's early access schemes, whether it's reimbursement, so that we have one sort of continuous approach to this.
Thanks, Sean. Nick, you touched on the importance of newborn screening earlier, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the programme at Genomics England and its potential role in driving forward diagnosis of rare diseases.
Thanks very much, Rosie. So that generation study is a research project that's going to stretch over at least the next 2 years or so. I just want to shine a light on something really important that's happened there in creating this list of conditions that will be looked for using this research project. So to put that together, we had a group of UK scientists and clinicians, all based in the UK, from NHS England and Genomics England. They got together and used the criteria that there is strong evidence that genes cause these serious conditions and are highly penetrant, that they can be reliably detected, that early or pre-symptomatic intervention for the condition leads to substantially improved outcomes, and that the interventions are equitably accessible for all in the NHS. So it's a really useful list, but the important thing and the massive news is that they reckon there's more than 200 of those conditions in the UK that we can deal with in that way, which I think is a really powerful message for the future of screening, whatever happens with this project. It's a project that will bring us a lot of information about how powerful genomics is as a screening tool, and whether it can be delivered in the NHS, whether it works for families, whether the public like it. But whatever happens, we definitely have on record from a group of eminent scientists and clinicians in the UK that there's a lot more that screening could be achieving in this country. I want to stress, and I think I already have, that this is a research project. There's lots more we can do outside that as well. We had a really powerful public dialogue that paved the way to do this. But I think actually as this project grows in awareness in the public, we can revisit that conversation and talk about what, as a nation, we might want screening to achieve, whether we want to just focus on treatment, or whether things like early diagnosis for information, for planning, or for reproductive choice, or for research might be reasons to do screening in the future. So it really is a gateway towards lots of exciting opportunity.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, we'll have one more question before coming on to the Q&A questions. So, Steve, obviously your role at PwC, you cover a lot across the life sciences sector, and I wonder if you could just share some of your thoughts on what some of the most exciting sort of developments in the sector are that we'll hopefully see in the next few years.
Well, thanks, Rosie. We've just looked at the UK life sciences space actually, and I think we've come away from that really excited about the quality of the science that sits in the UK, and clearly, you know, when you look more globally, it's quite amazing. But the UK has some amazing science and across the different subsectors, and I think our understanding of genomic testing is fantastic. The cost of whole genome sequencing has come down, and clearly for rare diseases that's important, where they have a genetic source. But I mean, as Nick mentioned earlier, there are non-genetic diseases that impacting rare diseases, and so some of the other techniques around diagnosis are really interesting. I think the progress around molecular imaging and all sorts. But I think what we've seen in some of those early stage companies that will come through in future products is an understanding of protein targets, an understanding of proteomics, and I think partly through progress in structural biology, being able to elucidate the structure of proteins, that's pretty amazing. And so what that's doing is increasing the number of druggable targets that companies can focus on. So that's come along quite some way. And then some of the companies where in the past, the big challenge was the genomics, and then it became actually the proteomics that flows from that. That has always been a bit of a challenge, but I think we're making real progress. And so some companies are focusing on the proteins that are causing diseases, and so we saw a number of companies focusing on things like target protein degradation, so really focusing on those disease causing proteins. I think that's going to be a really exciting area in the future. So I suppose that understanding of biological targets, the understanding of proteomics, the ability to manipulate chemicals to really bind into the active site, I think it's really exciting. And then of course you've got this big pipeline of advanced therapeutics in gene therapy and in cell therapy and even RNA technology. I think that's going to be really, really exciting. So it bodes really well for drug discovery, for patient diagnosis, and ultimately treatment of diseases. And that's before you even overlay what's going on with AI. So who knows how that's going to influence everything, but it's a very exciting time. And I think in our and our children's lifetime, we're going to see some massive evolution in some therapeutics, we hope.
Thanks, Steve. Nice to end that on a more positive point, which is great. Well, thank you. We'll move on to some of the questions from our audience. We probably won't have time to get through them all. I'll start with this one, which is on condition-specific quality of life measures. I think perhaps Sean and Nick might have some reflections on this. So the question's asking, does the panel think there is a role for a broader rare disease quality of life measure? Sean, could I ask you to start with reflections on that?
Oh, yeah. How long have we got? So I think it's been mentioned right at the very beginning. One of the I think challenges with rare disease is that they are very, very different. So having a broad quality of life already, I think that broad is not going to capture the specific quality of life impact for specific disease. We know, what we do know is that the current quality of life isn't appropriate, but I think there may be probably similar maybe similar conditions where you might be able to get a more appropriate quality of life measure. I know certainly there's been work done to look at for specific diseases quality of life measures, but it's a big undertaking, and then it's got to be validated. So having a specific QOL for every condition probably isn't achievable, and having one that covers all probably isn't going to be effective either. So it's got to be somewhere in between, but I think it is a very tricky one. I don't know, Nick, what your thoughts are.
No, I think your analysis of the challenges around getting a quality of life measure for specific conditions is, I agree with that. I think it shines a light on the fact that we're so, let's say, focused on health economics with our evaluation process in the UK. I think other countries have a broader, more holistic view of how conditions and treatments interact with the health system and the wider system supporting people that the government's paying for. And if we, in a sense, EQ5D finds it really difficult to see the value of a treatment and the impact of a condition. Human beings don't. If you just describe the condition, it's quite easy to actually see where the value would be. And maybe if we empower the committees to use other tools alongside health economics, then this question might become less important.
Thanks, Nick. I think you've also sort of answered one of the other questions we received around whether the current system does enough to recognise value in terms of patient carers in the system in the current processes, and what's the view in shifting this. I think, yeah, those two questions sort of link, and that's a good answer there, and that probably the UK system does not do enough currently, and that there are opportunities to do more. We had a question about the joint HTA in Europe, which was apparently a big topic at last week's World Health and Drug Congress. They've asked what the potential impact is of this in the UK. Tina, appreciate you might not know exactly what the impact would be in the UK, but could you share just a little bit more about the joint HTA?
Sure. So the joint HTA, so the regulation for EU HTA is under discussion in a way how to implement. So we are in the implementation phase of it, and it should get started in 2025. Focusing on oncology and ATMPs as at the first products to be looked at. So basically, what does implementation phase mean? Everything has to be discussed, how precisely the process has to look like, what is the role for each and every single stakeholder part of this process, what are timelines, how the dossier structure should look like, what shall be submitted, what are the rules for the committees, what the European Union has to set up. So yes, the regulation always lays out the rules, but how we can fill them with life is now up for discussion, and quite intense, because there is a lot to be discussed and how to get started, and 25 is somehow around the corner. So it's a lot of going on, a very detailed discussion with this regard, but I would leave the question on how does this influence the UK to one of the other panelists.
Yeah, I don't know, Sean, do you have any reflections on that question?
I'll be the optimist and say maybe this is an opportunity for the UK to be nimble, because I think, as you described, when you're trying to get agreement across multiple states on something as complex as HTA, I can't see a rapid answer to this one. So maybe, and quite seriously, it goes back to that question: how do you make sure that the UK is a priority market? If the UK sets itself up saying it's a great place for doing clinical trials, it's a great place for getting early access, early assessment measure, early regulation, then maybe this is the opportunity to actually make the UK look a very appealing market. The potential is there, just needs to be connected.
Thanks, Sean. Nick, sorry.
We could start by getting SMC and NICE to work together more.
Yes, that's a good point. I think that's probably all we've got time for today. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but yeah, conscious we're almost at 2 o'clock. So I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists for a really interesting discussion. And thank you very much to everyone who attended today. Do go read the full report and do get in touch if you have any questions about it. We'd love to discuss it with you. So yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.